and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and as always, my co-host, Derek Cohen. He is the Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. How are we doing this week, Derek?
We are doing just fine.
Excellent. Well, the big question, before we get into it, before we get to the show, the big question of the week is, you saw the USA News rankings come out. Austin is no longer in the top 10 of the greatest cities in America. Mm-hmm. Was that expected? Are you shocked by that?
I don't think I'm so much shocked by the fall in the ranking so much as to now who it's behind. I think that was interesting. Who else 40. Was on that list?
Lots of places I have not been. So I think number one was like Madison, Wisconsin or something. And so I know that you being from Ohio probably have some opinions about Wisconsin.
Actually, no. Wisconsin's actually really nice. I know this is high heresy. I commonly mix it up with Minnesota, which I know is basically like mixing up Ohio with Michigan. But, you know, it's one of those things where I think, when in terms of these rankings, I think another funny thing is, you observed, I believe when we were talking earlier, that Killeen and Beaumont had all ranked higher than Austin. And
Houston. Austin's still ranked number one, but Houston was number 10 out of 10 cities in Texas, with Killeen and Beaumont of all places. No offense to our friends in Beaumont and Killeen, but better than Houston. I don't know if that's right.
Well, Houston, but again, Houston's so big and so sprawling, it really doesn't have a central character. You know what I mean? It's the fact that it has two downtowns is enough to enough to confuse most.
Well, anyway, Austin's out of the top 10. It's number 40, and so I don't know. But most of this has to do with like the cost of living. It doesn't have to do with a lot of
We're
things
not
that we
doing
would think
great.
of.
We're not doing great there.
All right, well, moving on, getting into more serious issues. Of course, I always like to do a little shameless plug for our newsletter, our weekly newsletter. It's at texaspolicy.com/the post. It's the newsletter that talks about all things Texas and all things that TPPF is doing. There's some exclusive content in there, getting a lot of positive feedback. And if you're not on the list already, you can go to texaspolicy.com/the post and sign up for that as well. All right. So top topics for this week. We're going to talk a little bit about the parent empowerment pause that's going on right now at the Texas legislature. Illegal immigrants are going to get a Rocky Mountain high, according to Greg Abbott, our governor. Gender mod heads to the courts, which is kind of the playbook for the left, and so we'll chat about why that is. And the Texas House says "por qué nos dos" on property tax, and so there's some developments there. But I know there's a big breaking issue. We're recording this later in the week than we normally do, and so we just had some breaking news over the last couple of hours on SB 12. SB 12 is the bill that would block minors from attending sexually explicit performances. Some breaking news on that and its passage and all that. So let's jump into your Lege-Land update with that update.
Well, I think just broadly speaking, and we'll start at 30,000 foot and zoom in, is that this is the week where, we're really seeing what is truly going to progress. We've had that big deadline of House bills that need to get kicked out of the, or at least voted on second reading before getting sent over to the Senate. Now, whether they get referred or not over, there's a different question. But that was that was not last week, but the week prior. Mm-hmm. And so we're coming up on these other deadlines where now Senate bills are now having to meet certain thresholds, or they're the ones that are going to be done.
Yeah, it's getting real in the Senate. Even their ability to suspend the rules is now just still getting to be crunched on.
Well, especially when it comes to issues like adopting conference reports or taking concurrence votes, they can only move as fast as the House rules allow them to. Mm-hmm. For example, if they're waiting for conferees to be reported, all those things that they have a process to do, things could die in that particular process too. But you were asked about SB 12, the drag bill, and it had been watered down a little bit, mostly due to, I think, really the author's intent and really walking the fine line of some of the ambiguity there. Obviously there's a whole bunch of bad faith argumentation that, this would stop the people from seeing the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. And of course I was like, no, the Dallas Cowboys are stopping people.
I don't know what the Dallas County cheerleaders would look like, but probably not like the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders.
Hopefully they'd at least have a better record. But that being said, one of the things that we saw in that realm, again, was this whole what would this ban Shakespeare? Would this ban? And of course, that's super. We had this discussion in the Senate. Completely superficial misreading. But what we saw, though, interestingly, is when they went to a vote, and I number escapes me, I think it's 42, had 42 white lights on that particular vote after supposedly the, following the rumor mill on Twitter, whatever that might be, that there was a message from the LGBTQ caucus saying, vote your district. Well, interesting, when a lot of people voted their district, that they white lighted that, saying that, maybe this type of performance is not appropriate for children. And so, what started last week when we started seeing I would say the levee start to break on Democrats voting lockstep on some of these more social or cultural bills, is now we are basically in the deluge.
That they're having to actually stand up and vote and be on record as for this. And this is what I think is really interesting about this time of the session, is that, it's not, it's no longer messaging. We're not, jumping in front of the cameras or writing op-eds or any of that. You have to get down to, what is this bill about? And of course, the bill SB 12 and a lot of other bills are about protecting children. I mean, specifically, I think for a lot of us, we saw the videos last year of the drag shows, the sexually explicit drag shows, and you see the kids sitting in the front row and dancing around and handing dollar bills like they're at a strip show. I think, number one, most Texans were horrified that the performers will be doing that in front of kids, but also horrified that parents would be taking their kids to this kind of show. And I think a lot of us were even shocked that this would be legal, right? There's all kinds of things that they limit minors go to. You can't go to an R-rated movie. You can't go to a strip club and all of that. I guess if you call it brunch, suddenly now you can do whatever you want at it and let kids go. So that's where
that rule applies to day drinking, does it not?
It must. It absolutely must. So I think a lot of folks were shocked that it wasn't, that this was allowed in the first place. And so when you have a common sense rule that says, hey, this isn't appropriate for kids, the reality is that the left turned this into, this was part of the anti-gay agenda. This was about discrimination. And when we pushed back and said, look, you said, why would kids need to go to something like this in the first place? They said, oh, it was art. It was inclusion. This was about, they wanted kids to be there. And now, of course, here we are on the vote, and you have to have a recorded vote. Now, all of a sudden, the arguments are changing. This is about overreach. This bill would make it illegal for kids to watch, some movies from the 1960s or something. It's just completely bad faith arguments on their part. Now that they know that the bill is, in fact, about protecting kids, and the rubber meets the road. The record is clear. You have 42 Democrats now not wanting to be on the record opposing a bill that protects kids. I think it's pretty clear that their arguments were always disingenuous.
Well, even if you go with the partisan strength of a particular district, ones that are overwhelmingly, let's say, Democrat in this case, aren't monolithic. Yes, they might be monolithic in how they view certain issues, broadly speaking, and definitely in their preference of candidate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is an issue that they're willing to go to bat for. Again, we started seeing this particular levee break, back last week, and now I think people are really starting to say, look, I'm getting a lot of heat from my district, and not just heat from the activist class, from Texans for drag brunch performances and stuff like this, and all these AstroTurf groups, but you're actually seeing real constituents like, I walked blocks for you. Why are you trying to expose my kids to this? And that is a very, very tough question to answer to a constituent.
Or how can you be on the wrong side of protecting kids from chemical castration or from these, hormones and puberty blockers that studies are showing are having, lifelong effects in them, or having the inappropriate materials and pornography in school libraries. Constituents are trying to wrap their heads around. They might be Democrats, they might be liberals for all, for healthcare, for education funding, or for all these other reasons, and they're saying, wait a minute, I don't think that's what the Democrat Party should be about, or that's certainly not anything that I would believe in as well. Which is why now all of a sudden you have folks who have been making these arguments, trying to spin it back and make new arguments, and then at the end of the day end up voting, not voting, or present not voting.
Yeah, and I think that it's going to be tough for the self-appointed ideological enforcement police on the internet to have to track down all these malfunctioning voting machines.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that's probably the biggest issue of the day, but there's a lot that went on this week. Anything else before we jump into some of our top topics? Anything else going on the floor that's kind of under the radar, or anything else that you wanted to highlight about this week?
Well, I definitely think a lighter item could be the calls for concurrence votes, or non-concurrence votes, I should say. So you have an item eligible up. In other words, House kicked something over to the Senate. Senate took a look at it, changes something here, changes something there, sends it back to the House, and the House can go, we'll accept these amendments, or they can say, no, we're not going to do that. I just like the pomp and circumstance that when they decide to appoint conferees and not accept the amendments, it's usually along the lines of, we're going to go tell the Senate what's for, and I'm like, you're just going back to conference because they had a misspelling in the in the actual amendment, but otherwise, it's fun.
So
to
a lot of
watch.
gamesmanship going on.
I don't call it gamesmanship. I would say lightheartedness.
No more than property tax, which we'll get to sort of at the end.
Yes.
But I wanted to jump. Parent empowerment, school choice. Obviously, that was a big, still is the number one issue in the Texas legislature. There were some pretty big events. There was expected to be a big House committee discussion and debate around SB 8 and the new versions of it that had come out over on the House. But something happened on Sunday that threw kind of a wrench in all of this, is that the newest version of SB 8, the school choice bill, was unacceptable, almost insulting, frankly, to the governor. And he did something that he doesn't do a lot, which is a veto threat of that bill. How did that, what was the reaction at the Capitol, and kind of where do we stand right now with parent empowerment bill?
Well, generally, I think the reaction to the committee, the actual sub that the governor found so unpleasant, which I echo that sentiment. He basically said this is unacceptable. It carves out too many kids. It fails to provide this meaningful avenue for so many children, kids who need it the most within the whole system. And he said, look, if this is what you're moving, and this is what you're going to offer me, if this hits my desk, this particular vehicle right here, it's absolutely in the trash. And that's something that we've come to see on this issue, is Governor Abbott has basically put a stake down at every turn in the road and says, this is the standard, this is the standard, this is the standard. He's not going to just say, okay, well, since I promised school choice, we're just going to do something. I've not seen him take this level of leadership on anything prior to. And that's not an indictment of him. This is how much he is committed to this. And to be honest with you, if you're that bought into a particular policy reform or a particular agenda item, then yeah, it needs to be up to snuff, or what you would consider up to snuff.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is do you think this surprised Republicans in the House that he would issue a veto threat? But maybe they shouldn't have been surprised because he has invested so much in this issue.
Well, I don't think it's surprise, because for that very reason, he has not played this card close to the vest at all. He said we are going to have the most meaningful school choice program. He's sometimes have said most meaningful in the nation, which, of course, Texas alone, if we do anything, it's always the most meaningful, just about how many kids we have in the state. But that being said, is he promised a meaningful school choice reform, and I think that this is all part of delivering that. Now, I will say, I hope he's paying attention to some of the way some of these votes in the different chambers are going, because there's some folks who I know politically owe a lot of their good fortune to the governor, and those folks seem to be taking some questionable votes. And obviously, I think anyone with a cursory knowledge of this space knows exactly what we're talking about.
And then in terms of procedure-wise, and I'm definitely not the person you want to ask about that, so that's why you're here. But my understanding is basically they have 24 hours to do anything to get something out of an education committee so that it can even have the ability to be voted on in the House. But there's just nothing going on, right?
I think, and again, this is speculation on my part, even though I know folks who are more deep in the process. I think they're so far apart on the consensus, on the mechanics. I think that's a good read, and it's probably functionally dead for the regular session.
But that doesn't mean, the opponents of school choice should not rejoice and start popping champagne, of course, because there's always the special session, which I think everybody would agree is something that is in the cards for the governor should parent empowerment actually not get passed in the next week or so.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that the impulse, especially for folks who are kind of more lukewarm on the issue, but not, maybe school choice curious, but not hard charging. They'll probably be like, just give us something, for students with disabilities or low income, give them a couple bucks, and then, this whole thing will go away. And the truth be told, I don't think that would satisfy the governor, nor should it.
All right. I'm just glad you didn't go school choice questioning or plus or
well, we need
curious is fine.
But that's SB 8 was, while SB 8 still had its flaws, it was definitely parental empowerment affirming legislation.
All right. So it's not dead. We'll probably just end up in a special, which I think, we said don't put that out there, but I think it's pretty obvious that that's where we're headed.
We did 3 of them last time.
Yeah, and when that happens is anybody's guess, and the whole politics around that is also very interesting. So jump really quickly to a story that just came out as well involving the governor. Is now the governor, of course, has been sending these bus loads of migrants. We've had Title 42 expire last week, and we had almost 10,000 a day in the lead up to Title 42 coming across the border. And so he's been sending busloads of illegal immigrants to these liberal cities, these sanctuary cities like New York and Chicago, New York, Chicago. I can't remember the last one, but he's added one to the list. Now Denver is going to get a busload of migrants. So my question is, or I'm curious, is where next? Where next should the governor send? If he wants to spread the pain to these liberal cities that support sanctuary city policies that are making it, that are creating a magnet for illegal immigration, where on the list would you send the next busload?
Mountain View.
Okay. Yeah. It is intriguing that he hasn't been sending them to California, right? Like there hasn't been any. I don't think that there's been any that have gone to California, which is where you would think that he would be sending them.
Well, maybe they've heard of their crime and environmental issues, and they don't want to go there as well. Because keep in mind, this is a voluntary program.
Yeah, there's actually a bus that goes to San Francisco. Just no one's on it. They're all going to New York and Chicago. And
they're like, San Francisco? Are you kidding me?
But
is the Denver bus full?
What about Portland? Portland's another one of those cities.
And it's funny. So the one concern I have about Denver specifically is obviously that's going to be a very weather dependent one. It gets really cold in the winter, so this is at the outset of summer, there's a viable strategy. But again, we shouldn't be having to make these considerations, right? The big problem here is that we have individuals that are coming across the border illegally, and then we, because of either controlling law, we all like to blame the Flores decision, but the Flores decision still gives a lot of flexibility that we're not even operating within. We basically have created this situation, and I say we, the United States, has created this situation for ourselves wherein we really have no answer to this problem, and we have absolutely no leadership able to do that. Now, there's certain things that we can do around the edges here in the state. We've talked about some attacking the cartels involvement here, some of the elites that are facilitating it, the various things around that. But even that does not get at the problem that we have these, lies that are trickling down to all these other countries that basically, look, United States, you can just basically walk across the border and get in there, and then they'll, maybe sometimes slap an ankle tag on you, and then, you come back 3 years later.
If you come back.
That is such an untenable solution, and making a phone app for, pre-check-in like you would do if you were, picking up Buffalo Wild Wings or something, and so you can get that cleared before you get there. All that stuff is just absolutely I wouldn't even say it's not even putting wallpaper over the issue, because it's not even purportedly fixing the issue itself.
And I mean, with their experience with Obamacare, we know how good the federal government is at creating websites and apps. So I can only imagine how well that works. My vote would be Madison, Wisconsin, by the way. Speaking of Wisconsin, I was going to
say, summers are cold in Madison, Wisconsin, man.
No, but you bring it back to the policy, which is, of course, what we want to talk about. And in the legislature right now, they're still wrangling and debating over HB 7 and HB 20. HB 7 is the one that creates new legal authorities, creates a felony for illegally coming across the border. So it's creating new authorities for the state to assert its right to police its borders and protect its communities. And then, of course, you have HB 20. And I'm not, we talked a little bit how all that's kind of wrapped together and creating this new border. Now it's no longer a border protection unit. It's now a border protection force, and it will be under the Texas Rangers, creating new entities that will be able to police the border border and be able to
Which, of course,
enforce the law.
the rejoinder to that was, "Oh, you're growing government. You're growing government." The selective libertarianism is just fantastic.
Or I just think it's we didn't want a border protection unit, so now we have a border protection force. And I know there's a little differences between that and the other one. I mean, the one that always got me was the claim that it was a vigilante force when they were literally debating the legal authority for the border force to exist. So there's that's still up in the air in terms of what they're going to do there. That's not something I don't think that anyone's talked about, going to a special. So that's something that does have a clock ticking on it. It's something that needs to
Seems
get
to be
done
moving well, though.
Seems to be moving well, but definitely, we're getting down to the last minute here to work on that. Okay. All right. A couple other issues I wanted to hit for today, for this week. We sort of celebrated last week. SB 14 was the bill that protected kids from gender modification, or at least it banned the doctors from performing those treatments and those surgeries and those kinds of things. But it turns out that doesn't necessarily mean that the issue is over. That, in fact, for the left, really it's just beginning, because this is all part of the playbook for them, is that once these laws are put into place, then the lawyers come out. And almost immediately after the bill was signed and was on its way to the governor, ACLU of Texas announced that it was going to sue the state of Texas for discrimination, for discriminating against transgender youths, I guess, and not allowing these procedures, using the courts to pass policy. This is a pretty much a playbook, textbook play by the left. No.
Yeah, it usually works in liberal jurisdictions, so I have no idea how what the plan of attack is here. Now, if you look at what SB 14 does and how it was laid out and defended by Dr. Oliverson, you could see them trying to sow the seeds of this, saying, well, if we're providing this particular care for, so let's say with the puberty blockers, we're trying to provide this particular care for precocious puberty. Why does a kid's post-Bostock-oriented sexual orientation or gender identity, why can that be the basis for discriminating against the application of this? And of course, Dr. Oliverson rightly observed that, that is, you are using these particular medicines for purposes not for which they're designed, for this faddish treatment.
And not approved.
Not for the design or approved, for this faddish treatment of, reassigning gender, however you define that. And,
you're not doing anything like that when you're treating precocious puberty.
And so they're basically trying to stir up a, like an equal protection argument. But like, that is such a poor, I would say, approach to doing this. I mean, don't get me wrong. When you're sitting on as much, how do I want to put this? Money that they can get in small donations from folks by saying that Trump's putting kids in cages, as the ACLU does, then obviously they need to burn it on something. And now that they're no longer concerned with civil liberties and just part of the the left wing morass, that is essentially what we're going to see. The thing is, I mean, from an illegal analysis, it has no legs to stand on. And I would be very surprised if it even makes it to a higher level within the within the state courts. And if they try the federal court and because this is wholly within the Fifth Circuit, that seems like it would fare even more poorly.
Because the Fifth Circuit's much more conservative than, say, the Ninth or some other circuit. And and it probably will go the federal route, because the few places where the left has been successful in the courts, and again in a very limited context, they've been using Obama era rules and regulations. Of course, these are not laws that are passed by Congress. Right. These are rules and regulations that were they're essentially written out and added to the code through HHS. They're using Obama era regulations. Some of those were cleaned out and reversed by the Trump administration, which were then put back into place. So you have this kind of seesawing and going back and forth of what the law says and what it doesn't, which is a whole nother issue with the deep state. And
of course, Congress could actually just do its job, and we wouldn't be in this place, but far be it from me to upset, a century of administrative law.
And to their credit, it is a national issue. I mean, again, there's not a whole lot that can get done in Congress at any point, no matter who has the majorities. But there has been some discussion. They've seen in the states where this issue has a lot of support, frankly, bipartisan support. I mean, our own polling here in Texas shows, upwards of 60% of people support the ban for minors. You've got 34%, 35% of Democrats who support the ban. And I've seen internal polling from some of our pollsters that nationally, the ban on allowing kids to do this is upwards of 70% nationally. And that's a little bit different. It's not apples to apples with our polling because that's adults versus likely voters. But still, you're talking about, the vast majority of the country does not think that this is something that we should be allowing kids to do, especially when you compare it to other things like tattoos and smoking and other, these other things that are, that we don't allow kids to do. We don't allow them to make these kinds of decisions that have long-term health effects in those contexts, but suddenly we're going to let them do something like this. And so I think that, as the more it seems like that the left pushes on this issue, the more people learn about it, the more horrified that they are. And now you're upwards of, 75% of Americans are on the right side.
That doesn't surprise me in the least, just given some of the theatrics we've seen in the defense of that.
But that goes to the original point, which is, the left isn't even going to try to do it legislatively, right? Like they're going to try and do this through the courts, and they're going to make equal protection claims.
Yeah, it's not going. Well, I mean, the only way I can see they would have to make some sort of weird backwards full faith and credit argument that I was in California getting all sorts of, gender therapies and stuff like that. Why can't I get it in Texas? Yeah. But of course, I think that even that is subject to the regulation of the practice of medicine that the state clearly has.
The crazy thing, when they first started making this argument, it was just like, you had your head spinning because they were literally saying, well, you let the non-transgender kids get sex changes if they want it. It's only the transgender kid. It's just a crazy.
No one's getting this. That's the whole problem. The drugs that are being used need to be used for the specific purpose that they're designed for, not for this pursuit of things outside the standard of care, which this would be.
All right, so enough of those issues. Just want to highlight, because we talked about this issue before, some updates on that, and of course we will keep an eye on that. So now let's get to another one of the big issues for the week that's got a lot of updates, got a lot of things to talk about, is property tax relief. Does it feel like we are coming to some kind of agreement, despite all the memes and the back and forth and all the social media antics between the House and the Senate over the debate over how exactly are we going to get the biggest property tax cut ever in the state of Texas? It seems like we're starting, the dam is starting to break a little bit on the impasse, and sorry for the mixed metaphors there, but we're starting to get some momentum going.
Well, it was interesting. So today, watching the Senate chamber, the speaker during one of the many points of order that the Democrats were raising on something, probably alleging that a bill analysis said many people are saying, and then they said, okay, we'll name all the people. But anyway, you saw Speaker Phelan over in the Senate chamber, where he actually took the dais and got a photo out with handshaking with the lieutenant governor. And so there's a lot, obviously there's a lot, all the Kremlinologists are reading into that whatever they can. But I mean, I don't know what that portends for the state of the negotiations. I would probably put it in the camp of better, probably more good than bad. But that being said, we do see movement on the House version of SB3 as well, or I'm sorry, the House's take on SB3. That kind of, you said porque no los dos, kind of splits that down the center, in which it does have still an exemption component, but also the valuation cap component, and then of course obviously still using the compression as kind of the rounding it out.
Right. The House has always been for the appraisal caps. The Senate's been for mostly for the extending the homestead exemption. The big, if you missed it this week, the House agreed to do something on the homestead exemption and lift it to $100,000, where they had been talking about 40 or 60,000.
I have not yet looked at the new version, but I do know it was a lot. But keep in mind, but on the previous version, when they had the caps, that was on all the property, and they used that, whereas the Senate had an inventory tax. Obviously the question here is, what are we doing about businesses as well?
Right.
And so, because again, obviously as a homestead owner, and we basically, homestead tax really sounds great to us.
Yeah, we'll take that. Yeah. We'll take that.
But again, a lot of what makes the state so attractive is the ability to, run a business here without getting absolutely driven into the dirt by local taxes. Not that they're not getting, pretty crazy, but the fact that we have protections against that have kept that from happening. But that doesn't mean that they're not feeling the pinch too. So would any particular relief agenda have to check all the boxes? I would say yes. Now, again, whether we're going through the exemption or the cap, they're two radically different methods of doing it. But the fact that we've seen the photo op, the fact that we've seen this compromised version, at least we know that they're making good faith arguments. Of course, though, we could also take a more cynical view. Our CFO, Lou Stone, got to give a shout out to him. His whole idea was we basically parent trap the speaker and the lieutenant governor. Like, we send messages to each of them saying, meet up for, whatever. Yeah. I'm willing to concede to your tax, and like get them in the same place. And then we lock them there till they negotiate the tax money.
Meet at the Texas Chili Parlor, and when they lock them in the back room or something like that until they feed them habanero chili until they all come out with it.
So Lou's plan was literally to parent trap the speaker and the lieutenant governor. And then when I saw them together, I go, oh my God, he actually did it.
Yeah. Well, then we should film it. Yeah, and make sure and put it on a podcast or something.
I think Disney still has the intellectual property rights, and I hear they can be very litigious. So we'll be careful of that.
We'll just ask Ron DeSantis about that.
We don't need the mouse coming after us, man.
Okay. All right. So we're coming to the sort of the end of the show on some of the big issues, but I do, next week is it, right? I mean, we're getting really close to sign die. We have less than a week to go. Any predictions, any prognostications about what we might expect in terms of?
I guarantee the legislative session will end on the 29th.
Excellent.
The regular session.
Are we working next weekend? Is that the thing? Everybody has to be on in the building and on ready to go?
Well, that's actually kind of interesting, because when you get to that point, the most actionable stuff that's being done is chasing down conferees for signatures. Even just for the printing and distribution, by that point, that already needs to be done. And I remember, not to go too much into detail, but I remember being with James White at the time when he was running. I can't remember what the bill was, but it was running all over the place looking for the last, because you only need 3 on each chamber, right? So you don't need all 10, but you definitely need a majority of each chamber. And it gets to a point where sometimes people just it gets late in the day and they just head home. And sometimes you don't get that signature. So he wanted to make sure that they had that submitted. So that's what you're going to see a lot of towards the end of next week, is just making sure you have those signatures so they can take those adoption votes.
Well, maybe next week, because we'll be here. We'll have to work. We're working all next week. We're working probably through the weekend and through even the holiday, it would seem. Jefferson, our producer, of course, which I mean to give him a shout out every show. But, it's not on my list of things to say, so I don't say it. But I want to give a shout out to Jefferson, who's been with us here the whole session. So maybe the three of us will do another remote broadcast, maybe from the steps of the Capitol or something like that. Can we do that? All right. Excellent. All right. We'll check that out. Or the bar. Or the bar next door, or the Texas Chili Parlor. We'll just go in there.
As much airtime as we're giving the Chili Parlor, maybe we should approach for a sponsorship or something.
This closing was brought to you by the Texas Chili Parlor.
Not saying no.
All right, well, that's it for our show. We'll have a jam-packed, I guess the end of session show next week. So as always, we really do appreciate all of you who listen and all of you who watch the show. Thank you again for all your feedback and all your constructive criticism. We'll see you next week, and as always, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.